Hey, everybody, welcome back to the I Play 2 podcast. I'm your host, Rob Adler. This week, former football player and assistant coach Judd Garrett returns to the show. After he hung up his cleats, Judd became an assistant coach in the NFL. He worked in various roles under coaches such as Mike Ditka, Dave Wannstedt, Nick Saban, and Scott Linehan. After that, Judd became the director of pro personnel for the Dallas Cowboys, where he worked alongside his brothers, Jason and John. Judd, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks for coming back. I appreciate it. And first question is kind of to bring everyone up to speed. Why did you make the decision to retire and transition into coaching?
Football was always in my blood, and I tried to do some things outside of football after I was done playing, and it didn't really interest me. I didn't really have a passion for things outside of football, and I wanted to stay in football somehow. And I was fortunate enough to be hired by the Saints as a quality control coach when I was 29 years old, and it was a great opportunity. And even though we didn't win a whole lot of games there at the Saints, it was just a great 3 years of coaching under Mike Ditka and learning a whole lot. And it was just a great experience. So I had a hard time stepping away from the game after I was done playing.
Who initially brought you into the Saints? Was it Ditka himself or was it somebody else?
Well, actually, it's kind of an interesting story. I was pursuing jobs in the NFL, and when you're a younger guy at that time, I mean, your way in is as a quality control coach. And I had an interview with Chicago at the Combine that year. I talked to Dave Wannstedt. I talked to some of the other coaches. Matt Cavanaugh was the coordinator at the time and met with him. And I got to know Danny Abramowitz through the whole process. And he was their special teams coach. And I didn't get the job. And what happened was a couple of weeks went by. Mike Ditka got the Saints job. He hired Danny Abramowitz as the offensive coordinator. Things were sort of shaking themselves out at New Orleans. And I heard that the quality control job was open there. I just made a call over to Danny. He knew me and I was fresh in his mind. And the job had just opened up like a couple hours before. So I had some inside information and I was really the first one to call on the job. The next day, I'm just sitting at my apartment and get a phone call and it's Mike Ditka on the other end of the line. I didn't believe it was him to begin with. I thought someone was playing a joke on me. He just said, hop on the next plane down to New Orleans and we'll talk about this job. He brought me in. He interviewed me in the morning. They pretty much said, if you can start today, the job's yours. So I was fortunate enough to get hired. Being in the right place at the right time, I was able to make the call before everybody else. And Mike just pulled the trigger. They were sort of late in the game at that point. I think Mike got hired late, so they needed to fill up their staff pretty quick and just fell into place for me.
For people who might not be familiar with a lot of the position coaches and coaches outside of, let's say, offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator, what are the responsibilities of the quality control coach?
It's evolved over the years, but when I got that job, they had two quality control coaches on the staff, one on offense and one on defense. So I was the offensive quality control. And my job was I had to break down the last 4 games of our opponent that we were going to play. So I had to watch all the film. I had to put in all the data, personnel groups, formations, motions, the play call, the defensive front, the defensive coverage, the blitz, down and distance field position, all of that I had to record. So, I mean, you're talking 65 to 70 plays per game. It's 250, 275 plays I got to break down every week. And then you use all of that data to go through and discover or identify the defensive side of the ball's tendencies. What are their blitz tendencies? What are their coverage tendencies? What are their front tendencies? And we put our game plan together off of that. So if we know on 3rd and 5 to 9, they're a heavy blitz team, then we'll probably be more in a max protection mode. If we know at another down and distance, they're not a blitz team, then we'll get 5 guys out into the route, or they're a heavy cover 2 team on 2nd and 10 after an incompletion, then we'll have in our game plan in those situations, we're going to run the ball more, try to get 5 to 6 yards in a running game, get it to 3rd and 4, just all those types of things, just trying to identify their tendencies and use that information to determine how we game plan and also determine how we're going to actually call the game. The other aspects of it is I would do all the self-scout. So I'd break down our games, all the plays that we ran, and identify if they were efficient or not, and go through and determine when we're in three wides, we got a 67% efficiency rating. When we're in two tight ends, we're only 42%. So this gives us an idea of where we're efficient, where we're not efficient, what actual play calls are efficient. We run power, we're killing it for 60% efficient. But when we run counter, we're only 32%. We'll change our game plan accordingly. What plays we run well, what plays we don't. The third aspect was I would put together the drawings for the game plan every week. So I'd have to draw up how we blocked. I mean, obviously the O-line coach would make all the decisions, but I would actually draw the plays up that would go into the game plan playbook every week, and also the full playbook that the players get at the beginning of training camp.
That sounds like a lot of work. Did you sleep?
It was a lot of work, and when you get into the season, you're going from 6 a.m. till midnight, 4 or 5 nights a week. That's the nature of it. It's a really hard life on the coaching side because it's very demanding of your time, and it takes time away from family and all that. So it's a tough life.
What was it like to work under Coach Ditka?
I love Coach Ditka. I would say 6 days of the week, he was one of the best head coaches I ever worked for. The seventh day, game day, was craziness because he was so emotionally invested in the game, almost like the way he was when he was a player, especially when things weren't going well. And he's a big, imposing guy with a booming voice. And so things would at times get a little bit out of hand on game day, but it was only because he was so emotionally invested in the game, and that's the way he reacted. I've been around other coaches that were a little bit more poised during the game, but the other 6 days was great. He gets a little bit of a bad rap. He's very smart, and he knows football. There were times at the Saints, say we had a bad game on offense, he would put the whole offense in the film room together, and he would go through every play, and he would coach every position and make legitimate, constructive coaching points to every position. He knew the game well. And he gave me my first job in the NFL. I always appreciate that. He treated me great. Right now, looking back on it, there's some funny stories to tell. At the time, it was a little bit crazy.
What's one of those stories that, looking back with hindsight, you view as funny?
There was one time, and we were up, I think a touchdown or less. We're up by one score. There was like a minute and 20 left, and I think they had one timeout left, and they had to go 80 yards for a touchdown. And defensive coordinator Saban Uralian, what he was going to do is he was going to play a little bit of a soft coverage, kind of a prevent type of coverage. And what happens is when you're doing that against an NFL quarterback, he's going to drop back. There's going to be openings in the zone, and he's going to complete passes, and they're going to gain 8 yards. They're going to gain 10 yards, and we got to go up and make the tackle and keep the clock going, and sort of a race against the clock at this point. Ditka didn't like that at all. He didn't like that we're playing soft, and so he was just yelling at Saban, "You got to get out of that. You got to blitz them. You got to go after them." And Saban held his ground, and he said, "This is going to work." And Ditka's like, "I'll bet you $1,000 it doesn't." And they got the ball, and he threw the ball, and our linebacker picked it off and slid down, and the game was over. And Ditka, he used to walk around with a wad of $100 bills. It must have been $4,000 or $5,000 worth of $100 bills in his pocket. And right there during the game, he whips out his big wad of money. He peels off 10 $100 bills, and he hands it to Saban. So I don't think the league liked that picture, but it was funny.
That is a good story. That's pretty good.
He was a great guy, and he'd be driving in a limo or just driving in his car, and he'd see a homeless guy on the side of the road, and he'd just pull over and give the guy $100. He was a very generous guy. Every away trip for 3 straight years, he took the whole coaching staff out to dinner at the finest restaurant in the opposing city. And those bills were probably $3,000-4,000. Treated everybody great. I really liked Mike.
After you left New Orleans, did you still keep in touch with Coach Ditka?
Not really. We ran across each other a few times over the years, but I never really had that close of a relationship with him where it was like I could call him on a weekly or monthly basis. But every time I ran into him, it was always good to see him and to reconnect with him.
After New Orleans, how did you end up in Miami?
Interesting story. I mean, things just sort of fall in place sometimes. The last year at the Saints, we were putting together this computerized playbook. Mike was a little bit ahead of his time, and he felt like this is the future. Everything's going to be on computers. We're wasting our time with these paper playbooks. So he made me the point man on that. And so I interacted very much with the company that was putting together this computerized playbook, and they were also working with the Cowboys. And Chan Gailey was the head coach of the Cowboys at the time. And I guess this company really liked the insight I was giving them as far as what a computerized playbook should look like and how we should approach it. So I think there was a lot of positive messaging to Chan about me through this computer company. So we get fired at the Saints. I'm looking to get another job in the NFL. Chan gets fired at the Cowboys. He gets hired at the Dolphins, and they need a guy to do all the quality control. And he called me and just said, hey, the people at Knowledge Inc., that was the name of the company that was doing the computerized playbook, have said great things about you and just how good you are at your job and all that. How would you like to come here and work with the Dolphins with me? And so he brought me down, and I had to interview with Wannstedt and the coaching staff, and they gave me the job. So it kind of worked out.
When you get hired in Miami, what were your responsibilities?
Let me back up a little bit. I mean, as the quality control coach of the Saints, I was doing all that work. But the first year I was on the field coaching tight ends and also helping out Bobby April on special teams. And then the last 2 years I was working with the running backs and helping out with special teams. So then when I got to the Dolphins, the first 3 years I was working with the receivers and still doing all the quality control stuff. And then the fourth year, I was working with the quarterbacks.
In terms of working with the position groups, whether it be special teams, receivers, quarterbacks, etc., how do you have to change the way you communicate with them?
You have to learn the language that's connected to each position. My communication style didn't change the way I interacted with the players. I didn't have like a different approach. To me, especially at the NFL level, these players are just looking for a coach that's going to help them play better on Sundays. And if it's a matter of working on a specific technique that they need to master or giving them some sort of insight on the opponent that they can take to the game with them, that's sort of what the players are looking for. And that's sort of what I tried to impart on the players that I work with. So I don't think there's a real change in tone. There's not a change in style for me. You have to learn the specifics. I mean, when you're coaching tight ends, you got to understand all the run blocking and pass protection footwork that's connected to that position. You don't really need that type of knowledge when you're working with receivers. You have to be more in tune to teaching them on releases, working on all the different types of routes they can run, catching the ball, and things like that. So individual skills and techniques are different. So you have to develop a mastery of those when you work with each position. But that's really the only thing that changes.
For you, no matter where you've been coaching, what to you makes a player more coachable than anything else?
They have to be open to the coaching. And to me, that falls on both sides. The player needs to be open to the coaching, and the coach has to, like I said, develop a mastery of the position, that they gain a level of credibility with the player, that the player's open to the coaching. I'll tell you a quick story. After I got fired from the Saints and before I got hired by the Dolphins, there was about a 3 to 4 week gap. This is 2000, leading up to the 2000 draft. And Tom Shaw, I don't know if you've ever heard of Tom Shaw, but he's become a little bit of a guru as far as developing players' speed as they get ready for the combine. He worked with the Saints when I was there, but he was also doing some stuff with the college players. So he calls me because he knows that I'm not affiliated with the team at some point. He says, so why don't you come out 3-4 days a week and work with these players that he has and help get them ready for the combine. And he was handling all the speed and strength stuff. He wanted me to work the on-field drills and the throwing and the routes and all that. And one of the quarterbacks there was Tom Brady. And I kicked myself because I wish I would have had this insight back then. Tom Brady was one of the most coachable players I've ever been around. I only worked with him probably 8 or 9 practices, so I'm not saying I had any influence on his career. But when I would set up the drill and he was the quarterback, I would tell him what I wanted, tell him what footwork I wanted, I'd tell him how I wanted him to throw the ball. And he would try to incorporate everything I said into what he was doing. And then after he did it, he would turn to me and say, "Is that what you wanted?" And if I said, "I kind of wanted something different," he'd say, "Okay, let's do it again." And of all the people I've ever coached and all the different levels and different teams, he was the most coachable. He was the guy that I just felt wanted to learn. And I don't purport myself to be a quarterback guru in any stretch of the imagination, especially back then when I was a younger guy and didn't have as much experience. And he was trying to learn from everybody and get it right. And he was determined to do it. He was 100%, "Is that what you wanted?" And then if it wasn't, he would say, "Let's do it again." And then there was a handful of practices where he came up to me and said, "Hey, let's work on these 2 routes." And we'd stay another 20 minutes. That's what you need to be as a player. You need to be willing to put your ego aside and say, "I can learn something from everybody." And I think a lot of players have a little bit of this attitude of, "Who are you? You got to prove it to me that you're worth listening to." And in the long run, it hurts because it stunts their development. And it only made sense as I watched Brady's career that it took off the way it did. Because you take a guy like Tom Brady, who's so open to coaching, especially when he was younger, and you pair him up with a guy like Bill Belichick, who's one of the best coaches in the league, and his development is just going to take off. And that's what happened.
When I was doing Pro Day back in 2007, similar example to this, there were 2 guys that were being worked out. One was a guy named Tim Crowder, the other one was Brian Robeson. And Crowder definitely had the size, speed, all that kind of stuff. But Robeson was clearly more coachable, and there was a drill, and Robeson missed it the first time. I forget who the defensive coordinator was, but I think it was somebody from Arizona. Showed him what to do, did it right. Crowder just struggled with it. It was like 7 times before he got it right. And when you look at NFL careers, Robeson had a pretty good career in Minnesota. Crowder's career didn't go nearly as well, to prove your point.
There's examples all over the place of that. The guys who are coachable, the guys who are open to hearing feedback and trying to implement it, those are the ones that really maximize their ability. But there's a lot of ego. You get into the NFL, you get a lot of alphas who feel like they know it all. And I'll be honest, I felt like I was coachable and I would do what the coach said and try to do it. But I mean, there was also a little bit of that. I had that. The coach had to a little bit earn it with me before I started really trusting him. And as I look back on it, it probably hindered me as a player to a certain degree.
In terms of earning it from the player side, how did that help you maybe relate to the players you coached from the coaching side?
I understood that that was the challenge of being a coach, is you had to earn the respect of the players. And I remember the first year at Miami, Dave Wannstedt used to bring in these different types of people who would sort of try to help us. They'd sort of watch us coach and interact with the players, and they kind of give us feedback and all that. And I remember Chan Gailey asking the question. He said, "The hardest part is, in order to have success, you have to have the players buy into what you're doing. But in order to get the players to buy in, they have to see the success." So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing that you have going on, because you're not really going to have the success as a team or as an individual until you really embrace the coaching. But a lot of these guys are held back by, like, I don't know this guy, so they haven't really experienced the success with them yet to buy into them. It really helps a team, a coach and a staff, if when they take over a team, they have early success. Then the players start buying in. So Belichick, he wins early at New England. He wins in his second year. And then immediately he has credibility in that locker room. And what he says and all that becomes gospel. Whereas other coaches who didn't have that immediate success, that's their uphill battle on a yearly basis, is getting these players to buy in. You don't have that Super Bowl skin on the wall that you can point to that gives you that instant credibility.
Getting back to Miami, You worked for a lot of offensive geniuses. You mentioned Shane Gailey, Norv Turner, Mike Shula. What was it like to work and learn from all those different minds?
It was great. And they all were different. They all had different offenses. They all had different approaches. And all their approaches were good approaches. There's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, as they say. Chan's approach was different than Norv's, no question about it. But there's a lot of things that I learned from Chan that I brought with me the rest of my career, and a lot of things that I learned from Norv that I brought with me. I was always frustrated at times because when I first got into the NFL as a coach, late 90s, that whole West Coast offense was sort of the flavor of the month. And there were people who actually believed that if you didn't run the West Coast offense, you were sort of like running a high school offense. There was a little bit of snobbery around the league from the West Coast guys. But the West Coast offense has a lot of things that I've incorporated wherever I went. But all these other systems are really good too. So being able to learn from a lot of different philosophies, a lot of different offenses and different coordinators, I think makes you better. It just expands your whole idea of offensive football.
What was it like going from Mike Ditka to Dave Wannstedt?
Dave, he wouldn't make the big bombastic statements that Mike would. I mean, Mike, to a certain degree, he didn't really care very much about the media. So if he didn't think a question was a good question, he would just call it out, where Dave was a little bit more diplomatic. Dave was a really good coach, very good defensive-minded coach, treated me really well, never had any issues with him. I didn't feel like he had the same level of command over the team that Mike did. When Mike walks in the room, he sort of consumes the room. All eyes get pointed to him for whatever reason. He has sort of that magnetism. And Dave, maybe not so much. That's not a shot at Dave because it's hard to create that. And I think very few coaches ever do. But Mike sort of had it. But Dave was a really good coach. And we had a lot of success, 4 consecutive winning seasons, went to playoffs, won divisions. So he had some good success at the Dolphins.
When it comes to the success at the Dolphins, is there a particular game or moment that sticks out for you?
I think the biggest one was Indianapolis versus Peyton Manning. They were still in our division back then. We won the division. They were second in the division. And Peyton was finally hitting his stride. He was lighting up the scoreboard. And it was the first playoff game. And we took him to overtime. We sort of contained him. And Lamar Smith, he had like 230 yards rushing. And we beat him in overtime. And it was sort of a big win. I think that was probably the biggest one.
After Coach Wannstedt was let go, Nick Saban came in. What was it like working for Saban in comparison to working for Wannstedt?
With Nick, as great as he is, he's a hard coach to coach for. He's very demanding. And it's hard with that type of style in the NFL because as we went over, you're working from 6 a.m. till midnight, and that goes on for 6 months out of the year. And with Nick, you're a little bit on pins and needles the whole time because he has no qualms about calling anybody out at any time and demanding things. And it's effective and it works. But on the other hand, it's hard to work that way. Just mentally and emotionally, it can kind of wear on you a little bit. But if you want to talk about learning from somebody, for the 1 year I was with him, I learned a heck of a lot from him about all aspects of coaching, the way he coached his defense and his secondary. I'm a defensive coordinator in high school now. I mean, some of the things that I learned from Nick on matching routes and coverage adjustments and things like that, I'm still implementing to this day.
Why do you think he wasn't as successful in the NFL as he has been in college?
The NFL is a unique situation in that it's really, really difficult to have success in the NFL on a consistent basis if you don't have a quarterback. And the 2 years he was at the Dolphins, he didn't really have a legitimate quarterback. The first year, there really wasn't a legitimate starter on that team. A couple backups who were trying to be starters, and it's hard to win that way. And then the next year, Culpepper, he wasn't completely healthy. So his performance wasn't normally what Culpepper had been giving him. So he never really had a quarterback. And that's a little bit what skews the NFL, is that if you don't have a quarterback, you're fighting an uphill battle. But we won 9 games the first year playing backup quarterbacks. So you can win to a certain degree without a quarterback. You just can't take the next step. And I think that, as much as anything, is the reason why he wasn't more successful.
How come you left Miami under Saban after just 1 year to head to St. Louis?
A couple reasons. I mean, I was still kind of doing the quality control work and then working with a position at Miami, even under Nick, and then going to St. Louis. I was going to be a full-fledged position coach. I didn't have to do the quality control work. I could just focus 100% on coaching the position. Also, my wife's family was from St. Louis. One of the things about being an NFL coach is it's really hard on your wife. It's hard on your kids. So I felt like getting my wife to her hometown, I think, would be good as well. So the opportunity presented itself and I took it, and probably would have liked to coach with Nick a few more years and learn a lot more. But the whole thing sort of seemed like it was the best decision to go to St. Louis.
What was your role in St. Louis? You were a tight ends coach, right?
I was the tight ends coach, yeah.
You had worked with receivers, you'd worked with quarterbacks, you'd worked with special teams. Had you worked with tight ends before that point?
The first year at the Saints, I helped out with the tight ends. Dan Neal was the tight end coach, and I was his assistant, and we handled the tight ends together. And I learned a lot from him. He was a former offensive lineman for the Bears under Ditka back in the 80s. So I learned the blocking piece from Dan, and the years I spent working with the receivers at the Dolphins helped me work with the receiver piece with the tight ends.
When you were the tight end coach with St. Louis, the position itself was kind of evolving. What was it like to be a coach during that transition?
We were still using the tight ends traditionally. The first year we played with young guys, Joe Kloppenstein, Dominic Byrd, Aaron Walker. The next year we got Randy McMichael. And Randy was more of a traditional tight end. He could block on the line, but he also could run routes and catch the ball, but he wasn't a real dynamic receiver. He was more of a possession type. But it was evolving, and wish we had a little bit more foresight, because I think a guy like Dominic Byrd would have been more of sort of the H-back. We were still locked in a little bit into the traditional way of doing it, so we were asking him to play some online tight end when really his skill set would have fit more with the way they use tight ends now. So he was a little bit of a misfit with what we were doing, but I wanted my guys to be more involved in the passing game. I wanted them to have that. The Rams offense at the time, we still had Torrey Holt, we still had Isaac Bruce, we had Steven Jackson. So those were the first options. The tight end was sort of an afterthought. So it was hard to get them integrated into the passing game.
You moved back to St. Louis, and then a family tragedy strikes. Unfortunately, your wife passed away. Could you walk me through what happened?
There was a family history of heart ailments. She had 3 brothers, and for whatever reason, they would have these situations where their hearts would go into arrhythmia for no really known reason. Her one brother had a couple episodes of that. The other one had one. So all the ones that kind of cropped up, it was during the day. So you can get to a doctor, paramedic, get your heart going normal again, and end up being fine. She had it in her sleep. So your heart's in arrhythmia for an extended period of time. It's not good. So I didn't really realize what was going on until it was going on for a long time. And if it would have happened 6 hours later when she was awake and walking around, we get her to the hospital and everything's fine. But since it happened in her sleep, she wasn't able to survive it. So that happened during training camp going into the 2007 season. So I had to take about a week off, and I came back and coached the rest of the year, and we didn't have a very good season that year. And they ended up cleaning house on the offensive side of the ball. So I ended up getting let go at the end of the season.
There's a lot about single moms, but how hard was it for you to suddenly become a single dad?
It was difficult. I had to hire sort of a live-in nanny. And especially during that part of the season when I'm not home very much, she did a lot. Now the kids were off to school for bulk of the day, but that was hard. And then after the season, I didn't really know what I was going to do because coaching and being a single dad of 4 probably was going to not work out. I did it that first year just because I didn't have anything else to do. But the next year I was contemplating what to do. I was probably going to make a career change, and Jerry Jones called me and offered me the pro personnel job, which is more of an office job. The hours are a lot better. They're not 6 a.m. to midnight. There's more like 8 to 6, a more normal working hours. So I was able to take that job and stay in the NFL and still be able to raise the 4 kids.
What's Jerry Jones like? Because his media persona is probably a little bit different, I would imagine, than what he's like away from the camera.
Jerry's a lot like Ditka in that the image that he presents to the world is different than who the person is behind the scenes. And that was Ditka. And that's Jerry Jones. Again, Jerry Jones has treated me great, and he's treated my whole family great. We can go back and forth about some of his decisions as sort of the de facto general manager of the Dallas Cowboys, and you shouldn't have done this, shouldn't sign that guy, why'd they draft this guy, all of that stuff. But you can do that with every general manager. No one's batting 1,000 in the personnel department in the NFL. Everybody, has their misses. But to me, Jerry is who Jerry is. He probably has a different lifestyle than I do. But just as far as working with him, I always felt like he was trying to make the right decisions and trying to inform himself as well as he can to make the right decisions. And like I said, sometimes those decisions were right and sometimes weren't right. But he's a little bit caricatured in the media, which is a little bit unfair to him. But like right now, you can criticize Jerry Jones all you want. The Cowboys have a very talented football team. Whether they're going to win a Super Bowl or not, that remains to be seen. But it's not like they're putting a garbage team on the field every year.
Do you have a story with Jerry that might illustrate his kindness that perhaps people who are just football fans don't get to see?
He was great when my wife passed away, and I wasn't working for him at the time. I played for them back in the 90s. Obviously, Jason and John were with the team at the time, but I wasn't a prominent player on the team. I was the end of the roster guy when I was with the Cowboys. So he reached out, catered a bunch of food for us. And then I think a little bit he gave me that job, partly because of he knew the situation I was in with my family. And felt like I did a very good job for him. It wasn't like I wasn't qualified for the job, but there were 100 guys that wanted the job as well. But I think he gave it to me because he knew that it would really help me out with my family. And I think he's really in tune to that, the different things that people are struggling with. And he seems to be able to step up and do the right thing that way.
You mentioned that the pro personnel job was more of an office type job. What were your roles there that were different from, let's say, being a coach?
Well, there was just a lot of film work. So you go into your office every day and you got to evaluate a bunch of players. We had to get an evaluation on every player in the league and even guys that gotten cut from teams. As a pro staff, we were evaluating close to 2,000 players a year. So a lot of the work that's done is at your desk, watching film, writing reports, stacking guys on different lists of priority and things like that. We also did a lot of the advanced scouting for the coaches. So towards the end, the last 3 or 4 years I was at the Cowboys, I was able to get back on the field and help out with special teams, help out with the positions. But the first probably 7 or 8 years, I was more strictly a pro scout.
What was it like to have the opportunity to work with your brothers, Jason and John?
It was good. I always tried to separate the fact that we were brothers. So there was a number of times that I would disagree with Jason or John on a player. They may really like a guy. I may think he's just average or vice versa. So I wasn't ever going to say, oh, that's my brother. I got to agree with him all the time. That's the head coach, that's the tight end coach. If I agree with him, I'll voice my opinion that I agree with him. If I disagree, I'll say that I disagree and tell them why. So that was sort of my approach. I mean, obviously, when you step out of the building, we're back to being brothers and all that, and we have a common connection with the Cowboys. So I like that part about it. But I treated Jason the way I would have treated Nick Saban or Mike Ditka or whoever if I was in the pro role. It's my job not to just rubber stamp what the head coach wants. It's my job to voice my opinion on what I think is best for the team. And if it happens to disagree with the head coach, then that's not something unusual where the personnel department disagrees with the coaching about players. So I was very aware of not falling into that trap of just sort of knee-jerking whatever John and Jason wanted, because I think that probably would have been detrimental to the Cowboys.
Who was a player you might have been right on, and then who was a player that Jason might have been right on that maybe you debated about?
Again, everybody has their hits and misses, so this gets a little bit tricky. But Russell Wilson, it wasn't so much Jason, but the coaching staff, a lot of the scouts were down on Russell Wilson because he's too short. And I didn't scout Russell Wilson, but I was watching offensive lineman. I think it was Travis Frederick from Wisconsin. So what happens is when you're evaluating players, if I'm looking at offensive linemen, I'm also going to kind of see what some of the other positions are doing. You couldn't help but notice Russell Wilson in college. He was clearly the best player on the field as I'm evaluating this offensive lineman. So when we go into the room, a lot of the coaches were like, this guy can't play. He's too small. He's going to get swallowed up versus bigger defensive linemen, blah, blah, blah. Scouts were down on him. We had decided to take him off the board. I went to Jason after the meeting. I was like, we're taking Russell Wilson off the board. I'm not saying we should take him in the first round, but to take someone off the board means we're not even going to let him in the locker room. I'm like, this guy's one of the best players in college football. But you have your misses too. I mean, I was very high on Paxton Lynch, and Jason wasn't so much. I thought the guy could really throw the ball, and I thought he was big and athletic and had a strong arm. And so we differed there, and he ended up being right, and I was wrong. So, I mean, it's a little tricky when you get into this type of thing, because I could sit here and just tell you all my hits and not talk about the times I missed, and I could come across as being the greatest evaluator of talent ever. But you're right on some guys and you're wrong on some guys. That's just the nature of the business.
How much does fit matter? It's almost like the right city has to fit the player, if that makes sense. How much does that play a role in perhaps evaluating one player versus another?
I would say it's not talked about very much unless it's really, really over the top. If the fit's going to be really bad, then maybe it'll be mentioned. The thing with Dallas is there's a little bit of instant celebrity here in Dallas. You're a Dallas Cowboy. You become a well-known celebrity in the Dallas area. I think more so than maybe in a lot of other cities. And the guy's got to be able to handle that.
Kind of interesting to me, because I would have thought that that would have been talked about a little bit more, just to make sure that a player's personality would fit in, not just with the team, but the rest of the city.
I think if you're talking maybe about the quarterback, someone who's the face of the franchise, that's probably a much bigger consideration. But whether the left guard or the middle linebacker or the strong safety, his personality fits in with the city, that's probably not as big of a deal. But if it's going to be the quarterback who's the face of the franchise, that probably plays a bigger role.
I would agree, and I think kind of a prime example of that is Geno Smith in New York and Johnny Manziel in Cleveland. If you had flipped those two guys that year, I think things might have been a little bit different for each.
Yeah, maybe. But Johnny had his own problems. Johnny's deal was, I don't think he ever understood what it took to be an NFL player, especially an NFL quarterback. And it's a shame because he was extremely talented. So I don't think he really had the right approach to being a professional football player. So I think he would have struggled at a lot of places. But I mean, I think your point's well made with Geno Smith. I don't think that was a good fit for him.
Why did you decide to leave the Cowboys?
When they fired Jason, they let me go as well. So I had a choice whether to keep chasing the NFL or settle down. I've gotten remarried, had 3 more kids, and my wife's established here with her career. We made a family decision that probably better to not uproot the family and continue to chase the NFL.
Where is life taking you after the Cowboys?
Well, I'm still a little bit in football. I'm the defensive coordinator at St. Mark's, which is a local high school here, private school. And then I'm doing some wealth management. A buddy of mine owns his own company, and he wanted to expand his company to other cities like Dallas and Chicago. And he just asked me to climb aboard and help him with that. And that's what I've been doing the past few years. So I'm able to stay in the game with coaching high school, and it's fun. It's not as time consuming as the NFL, whether it's high school or college or the pros. I mean, a football game is a football game. So you get the excitement of experiencing all that.
Is there any difference in terms of coaching high school players as opposed to coaching pro players?
The pro players are much more talented. They're bigger, stronger, faster, obviously. The other thing is they're further along in their football development. When you're with high school kids, you're more dealing with the fundamentals of the game and teach them that. And we get into some coverages, different coverage schemes and matching routes and doing things like that. But we got to be really strong on developing the fundamentals of the players. When you get to the NFL, the fundamentals are in place for the most part. So you're able to take them to a different level. So I think that's probably the biggest difference.
Coach, I want to thank you so much for coming back to the I Played 2 podcast today. It's been great to hear your stories coaching under Mike Ditka, Dave Wannstedt, Nick Saban, and alongside with your brothers. Congrats on getting back in the game with St. Mark's, and best of luck in the future.
Well, thanks for having me. And anytime you want me back, I'll be glad to come on.